Greetings. In the wake of my video titled The Limits of Sanitary Conversation, I happened upon an interesting comment, a sort of response to what I was saying, and I in turn thought it might be an interesting endeavor to make a response video to the comment itself and really expand upon some of the things I was talking about. So as you can see, here's the comment. If the gentleman chooses to identify himself, he's free to do so. But ultimately, it's irrelevant, his identity. I'm simply focusing on the comment itself. So let's read it out. Please cite the civilization that has risen to a dominant position without significant social and religious pressure. Sure, we can find a few in their quote-unquote decline period, but I don't know of one that has quote-unquote risen with the quote-unquote free and open model, which intuitively seems like it would be better. Often in complex systems, in brackets like the human body, it is often, that is redundant, it is often the counterintuitive solution, like intermittent fasting, that is the most successful. Why is it that the free-thinking knowledge lovers always need to hijack a society that has relied on concepts like outcasting, that is a neologism and a clever one, and blasphemy? Why can't they just form their own utopias, somewhere else? With their incredible intellectual advantages, they would surely become beacons to the world in short order. Now, essentially what this comment is describing is the phenomenon of parochialism. Parochialism has been with human beings for a very, very long time. It is something that is actually distinct from authoritarianism, which I will be talking about shortly. But I do see parochialism and authoritarianism as a kind of two points on a fine line or a spectrum. Now, when we speak of parochialism, we're not talking, strictly speaking, of authoritarianism. We're not talking about what many people might be inclined to think of sort of the tyrant. But what parochialism tends to entail is sort of small-mindedness, limited perspective, narrow-mindedness, etc. The kinds of things that I was describing in that video, The Limits of Sanitary Conversation, and specifically the kinds of things that this gentleman is describing in this comment. The idea that there need to be sanctions, and indeed he mentions blasphemy and religious sanctions on things to prevent people from talking about things in order that there be harmony. His idea, his thesis, if you will, is that in order for civilization to rise and maintain itself, there needs exist some sort of system, and this system has to be a system of the parochialism, which limits and constrains people's ability to enter into discourse on certain topics. But essentially what this boils down to is that tired old line of argumentation we've heard with reference to, say, the gender conflict and gender relations. It's just another variant of it. It's a traditionalist argument. It's the argument, we all always did it that way, so it's always going to be that way, and it's always going to be best that way. That sort of thing, right? It's not a very good argument, and there are actually some counterpoints to be made here. But before we proceed, we should understand what civilization is, what we understand civilization to be. I am willing to concede that the parochialism that he has described has served as a form of, a loose form of social cohesive. That is, it tends to keep people from each other's throats to some degree, but it's not terribly effective. We need only look at the recent past, the middling recent past and the distant past to see the litany of corpses that have come about as a result of internecine conflict and war. So the idea that parochialism as a form of social cohesive somehow has allowed civilizations to rise and fall is dubious to begin with. But when we think about civilization, we are generally thinking about modern civilization. We're thinking about the modern comforts we've come to know, the microphone I'm using, the internet that we're on, the sewer system, flushing toilets, running water, stoves, transportation, supersonic flight. All of these fantastic things, and it doesn't take much thought to realize that none of that has anything to do with people being parochial. The parochial folk, generally speaking, didn't contribute to that. Now, I'm going to cite the rather famous Galileo case, and of course, prior to him, Copernicus. What many people don't know with talking about Nicholas Copernicus, who was approximately a century prior to Galileo's time, is that he had, in fact, made identical observations concerning heliocentrism as opposed to geocentrism in a Latin book called De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, I think that was the reference, which is simply on the revolution of the celestial spheres. That's what the English title might be. I can't think of the English title off the top of my head. Anyway, he didn't want to publish this. He was too reluctant to publish this work on heliocentrism. And for those of you who don't know, the Catholic Church for untold centuries held true to the Aristotelian principles of geocentrism. That is to say that in our galaxy, all the planets, including the stars, revolve around the Earth, which we know, every child knows now, is incorrect. But still, back then, it was a big deal. And as I said, I see parochialism and authoritarianism sort of as two, they're very much related to each other. Small-mindedness and a willingness to suppress knowledge and facts and discussion for the purposes of exercising authority and political power and influence, they're not too dissimilar. And in the best of ways, I could say that parochialism serves authoritarianism. Copernicus did not want to publish this, and he actually never did. We found out about this later. Of course, about a century later, Galileo published results, and it gets him into all sorts of hot water. He had a trial, etc., and it was a big deal. Now, these were men of science, men trying to understand the universe, and of course, not directly related, but indirectly, all scientific discovery that runs contrary or counter to what's generally accepted as true, what is, in the words of the parochial, blasphemy, that is something that runs counter to the rise of civilization. When you prohibit and limit people's ability to do things, that is not going to allow for the continuity of civilization, much less the actual progress of civilization. Everything we've come to know in modernity has been the result of people willing to take a risk and make discoveries and try to understand things. And sometimes these things were in direct conflict with the parochial attitudes of the time or the authorities or both. Much more recently, we have the Scopes monkey trial. I think it was 1925 off the top of my head in, you guessed it, the south of the United States. And this, for those of you who are not familiar, a gentleman named Mr. Scopes, a school teacher, was teaching evolution in school back then. Controversial even back then, or I should say even back then, specifically back then. It turned into a trial because I think it was in Tennessee, if I'm right. I might be wrong about that. And turned into a trial because it somehow violated the state law and blah, blah, blah. Long story short, he lost the trial, the school teacher. He was fined. This was seen as a short-term victory for creationism, etc. But nobody who understands anything about biology denies the fact and the reality of evolution. It's all around us. You can't even understand microbacteria without understanding evolutionary theory, and you can't understand the development of antibiotics, etc. This is fundamental to our understanding of life, bios, biology, and yet it was a group of highly parochial people who attempted to prohibit this, and they continue to do so occasionally. Parochialism does not allow for the rise of civilizations. inventiveness does, invention does, and by extension, the willingness to talk about and discuss these things. Now, there's another element to the parochial, to preventing discussion, and it's that the people who are seeking to prevent discussion of these things, this person, for example, who claimed he was offended when we were talking about male circumcision, they're running away from something, and they will have to spend their entire lives running away from a certain topic which they deem offensive. Now, both the left and the right, in fact, are guilty of different forms of the parochial. Parochialism is not limited to the right, to the religious right. We just see it as a different manifestation of the left, for all are guilty in the eyes of the gods. The religious right, for obvious reasons, tends to oppose things like evolution, blah, 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 because it offends the dignity of man. We've heard most of those arguments. What does the pseudo-religious left do? Not all of them, of course, but some of them, and perhaps even many of them. When they find something that offends their quote-unquote humanitarian sensibilities, they tend to oppose it. For example, what if we spend time talking about the fact of human sexual dimorphism, that the human ape has two sexes, male and female, that they evolved and developed very differently. They have different brains, different bodies, different inclinations, and are a hell of a lot different from each other than we could have ever imagined if we actually give it some thought. No, they would say we're all the same and cite something completely irrelevant such as, look, Jill likes Fanta and so does Bob. We're not that different after all. This is what I would describe as sort of left-wing parochialism, the idea that either we shouldn't talk about these things, if we do, we should just talk about the similarities instead. And in end effect, it's the same as right-wing. The base result of all of that is the same as the right-wing parochialism. It's not all too different. And in the worst of case scenario, it is a form of authoritarianism. I mean, look at what we see in what tends to be left-wing dominated academia. Now, if extreme right-wing were dominating academia, we probably would maybe see the outright banishing of evolution and biology. But for example, we can't understand, as I was mentioned before, anything about biology without understanding evolution. But different people and different groups are opposed to it for different reasons. How parochialism, in light of all this, how the parochial has served as an engine for civilization is beyond me. Yes, it can, for limited purposes, serve as a social cohesive. But I would even argue that the social cohesive that the parochial offers is pretty damaging as well. I mean, what does it do? It prevents a lot of people who might be curious about things, who might want to talk about certain things, from talking about it. All hush, hush, hush. I can only imagine what goes on in feminist circles of the extreme. For example, Atheism Plus. There's this boogeyman in the room. Everyone knows what it is, called the truth and science and facts, but nobody can talk about it. And of course, they have their own parochial rules to guide them past that, so they don't actually have to discuss such things. And the right has it as well. There is no way, in light of all this, that prohibitions on conversation topics and talking about things that might run counter to the established view that this has somehow been productive for society and really created modern civilization as we know it. This is a poorly thought out line of argumentation, and it just goes back to, it's the tradition, so we should just continue it. And particularly with regards to blasphemy laws. I mean, in a universe without gods, it doesn't make much sense unless you think that the reason for that is less to do with gods and more to do with the purposes of this very limited form of social cohesion, which actually, at the end of the day, prevents and limits progress rather than furthers it. Anyway, that's all I want to say on this topic for now. I didn't want to talk too much about it, and brevity is not my strong suit oftentimes, so I will end it here. There will be more material coming, and as always, may the gods be with you. And no, for those of you who constantly ask me, I don't actually believe in the gods. It's kind of an inside joke. So you take care and have a good one.